Thanksgiving is a traditional American holiday which celebrates at its most basic level not starving to death. One of the most well-known and long-established symbols associated with Thanksgiving is the Cornucopia, which means the horn of plenty, a mythical representation of the never-ending bounty of the earth with an infinite ability to sustain life. The Cornucopia is infinite in its abundance. It never runs out, but always pours forth the blessings of the earth upon which all living creatures depend for their sustenance. This Thanksgiving Cornucopia illustration is from an invitation to a Thanksgiving observance that took place in Boston, Massachusetts in the year 1899. But the symbol of the Cornucopia goes back much, much further than that. We see the Cornucopia represented in the myths of ancient Rome, and even earlier than that in the myths of ancient Greece. In those sacred traditions, the endless cornucopia which never runs out of blessings. In those sacred traditions, the endless cornucopia which never runs out of blessings was traditionally associated with the god of the underworld, the god of the earth and of death, but also of the riches of the earth, the god Hades, who was often referred to as the wealthy one, or Pluton. He was one of the three divine brothers, along with Poseidon and Zeus. According to the myths, those three brothers drew lots to see which realm they would rule, and the result was that Zeus got to rule the heavens and the sky, and Poseidon got to rule the watery seas and oceans, and Hades, the earth, and all that was in it and under it, and all that it produced. Here's an ancient hymn to Pluton, which calls to him in these words: O Pluton, holder of the keys to the whole earth, to mankind you give the wealth of the year's fruits. Yours is the third portion, earth, queen of all, seat of the gods, mighty lap of mortals. The traditional understanding is that the gifts of the earth are unlimited and completely adequate for sustaining human life. Here's an advertisement using language that is at least as old as 1883, if not older, encouraging immigrants to come to California, the cornucopia of the world, with almost 43.8 million acres of, quote, untaken land, suitable for 1 million farmers, with a climate for health and wealth, free of cyclones and buzzards. Free of cyclones and buzzards. Of course, that land was not exactly untaken at all, since it was taken from the indigenous Native Americans to whom the land was given by heaven by virtue of their having been born in that land. And that attitude of taking the gifts of the divine realm that were given to others is very much part of this story, and we will return to that. But the point of showing this poster is the understanding which once prevailed that the land itself, the earth itself, is a cornucopia full of abundance, capable of sustaining life, conducive to health and growth and increased prosperity. This is the traditional vision shared by cultures everywhere, that the bounty of the earth is like an endless cornucopia that pours out its blessings to increase life, to increase health, to increase living standards, and that it is fully sufficient to provide us with what we need, not just to survive, but to thrive. In the ancient mindset, the traditional mindset, the gifts of the earth were the gifts of the gods. The grapes from which we make wine were the gifts of the god Dionysus. The olive tree, which gives us food and also olive oil, in ancient Greece was specifically understood to be a gift of the goddess Athena. The bounty of the ocean was seen as a gift of Poseidon, as were horses. The mineral wealth from under the earth was understood to be a gift from the god Pluton, the wealthy one. And the life-giving grain was the bounty of the goddess Demeter, known as Ceres to the Romans, from whose name we get our modern word, cereal. Here's a quotation from the ancient philosopher and initiate Plutarch, who in one of his essays asks, "Why slander the earth by implying that she cannot support you? Why impiously offend law-giving Demeter and bring shame upon Dionysus, lord of the cultivated vine, the gracious one, as if you did not receive enough from their hands?" That is the ancient understanding, and it's very clear the gods provide what we need, and their gifts are infinite and capable of supporting us, and we should not act as though they're insufficient. To do so is to slander the gods and to insult them, and it's a moral failing, and it leads to greediness and grasping and privatization, as though the infinite realm cannot provide enough to support life here in this material plane. But there is, as you might imagine if you've lived in this modern world for any period of time, a completely opposite philosophy to that Cornucopia philosophy, the vision of the Cornucopia that pours out its blessings. And this is a portrait that I'm showing here of one of the most influential voices of that opposite vision. The teaching that the earth is not sufficient to support the men and women that heaven allows to be born into this life. This is the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who was an English clergyman in the literalist Christian church and who lived from 1766 to 1834, and who wrote essays and books that persuaded his followers that, quote, "The power of population is so superior to the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man that unless arrested by the preventive check, premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race." What is he talking about? He's saying that the earth is not sufficient to support you. Exactly the opposite of Plutarch's quotation from the ancient world, in which it was seen as an insult to say that the goddess Demeter could not provide enough grain, or the god Dionysus could not supply enough wine. Malthus is saying that population will inevitably grow beyond the ability of the earth to support that population unless we check it, unless we block it, unless we restrict it, using something he calls the preventive check. If we don't use the preventive check, he says quite directly, then we will get premature death in some shape, in some form or another. And he lists those causes of premature death that must come if we don't use the preventive check. Those forms of premature death that Malthus lists include epidemics, pestilence, and plague, and if those don't kill enough, then the final killer, Malthus says, is famine, which comes behind those other ones and at one mighty blow levels the population back to the level of the food supply. Now, Malthus wasn't pro-famine. He was pro the preventive check. So his opinion was you either use the preventive check or you get epidemics. That's Malthus' teaching. Pestilence, plagues, and finally famine, which he calls the last most dreadful resource of nature to level off the population that grows beyond nature's ability to sustain life. So in his view, nature is drained of any vision that it's a cornucopia with endless ability to sustain life. It's drained of life-giving Demeter and Dionysus with endless abilities to sustain life. And it's turned into this dead, static, fixed cage with immutable boundaries that you can't go beyond. If men and women try and go beyond those boundaries, if they try and get out of the box, nature will send plagues and other means of killing until ultimately famine is the last killer in line that will eventually take care of the problem to keep men and women inside that box. This is a fixed pie view of the world. Like there's only so much pie, you can only slice it up into so many pieces, and so any gain by one has to be at the loss of another because it's a fixed boundary. You can't go beyond those boundaries. And that's a vision that's at the heart of imperialism and colonialism and exploitation and the stealing of the resources that are given to the people of different lands, which goes on to this day, and which was certainly part of what we need to remember on Thanksgiving as well. This Malthusian view is absolutely anti-human. Its advocates believe that growth for all is impossible, and so its central teaching is austerity, getting by with less. And that starts with less people. Yes, central to the teaching of Malthus and his followers is the idea of fewer men and women. And the way you get that is, well, you're either going to get it with plagues and famines or with the preventive check. What's the preventive check? Fewer babies. That'll lead to fewer men and women, and then you won't have to have the plagues. That's Malthus's teaching. You either use one or the other. You either use the preventive check or you're going to get pandemics and famine. And that is what preventive check means. What is the preventive check, according to Malthus? Very simply, less sex. He comes right out and says it. He's all about fewer babies, and in his day, that means less sex. So for him, the best way to do fewer babies is to have later marriages so that couples have less time to have babies. That's what he means by the preventive check. In fact, if you turn the page from the one we were just looking at, he comes right out and says moral restraint, by which he means, quote, infrequency of the marriage union, which means less union between men and women, less sex, even within marriage. And that, in the opinion of the Reverend Malthus, is, quote, the most powerful of the checks to keep down the population to the level of the means of subsistence, end quote. So there's your choices. Less sex or else epidemics and famine. And he wasn't for epidemics and famine. He just saw them as inevitable. He was for less sex, and then we'll prevent epidemics and famine. Now, I can hear Plutarch saying, why slander the earth by implying that she cannot support you, Malthus, you immoral person, slandering the gods, as if you did not receive enough from their hands? Disgusting. Twisted doctrine. Anti-human doctrine. Why is this teaching so twisted? Why is it so immoral and so misguided? Well, the ancient myths teach very clearly, very, very clearly, that the increase of the earth is a gift of the gods, as we've already seen, and the ancient myths also teach that the gifts and talents given to individual men and women also have their origin in the heavenly realm. In other words, men and women and their gifts are also dependent upon the gods for those gifts. That's the source of the gifts. That's why there's so many myths in which forgetting where those gifts come from gets punished by the gods, such as the powerful story of Eros and Psyche. At the beginning, we learn that Psyche was this beautiful young woman, so beautiful that the people of her town started saying she was more beautiful than the goddess of beauty herself, which is a major mistake and always results in disaster in the myths. And we see myth after myth that follow that pattern, where someone's a very gifted weaver, and she says, oh, I'm a better weaver than the goddess of crafts and wisdom and weaving herself. And she gets punished. Over and over, it's shown that it's a major moral failing to forget that the very source of those gifts that are given to men and women is the gods themselves. So in this case, the source of Psyche's beauty is the goddess of beauty. So it's a moral failing to start saying she's more beautiful than the very source of that gift, the very one who gave her that gift. And that myth pattern is repeated over and over throughout many, many myths, where you don't set yourself up as above the gods who gave that gift, the source. So that shows very clearly that the gifts of men and women come from the gods. And in fact, the birth of every single baby was seen as happening only with the permission of the gods, of the divine realm, because the invisible realm is the source of all life. Think about it. Life itself is miraculous, whether it's in a seed or in a child, that growth is miraculous. Where can life come from in this material realm? It's not just a material thing. It's some kind of a divine spark that comes from the invisible divine realm. This is an ancient painting of the goddess Artemis with her bow. She's a virgin goddess, but even though she herself has no children and thus has never been in labor to deliver a child, it was understood that no mother could give birth to her child without Artemis being present and allowing that mother to be delivered and that child to be born. Here's an ancient hymn to Artemis, which addresses the goddess this way. Hear me, O Queen, Zeus's daughter of many names, torch-bearing goddess, bringing light to all. You help women in labor, though you know not what labor is. Goddess of swift birth, you are a nurturer of mortal youths, accessible to all, bringing forth the beautiful fruit of the earth, lovely peace and fair-tressed health. Look at that. She's a nurturer of mortal youth. She's accessible to all. She permits women to deliver their babies. She's a giver of health and the fruits of the earth. It's the opposite of Malthus again. So every child is allowed to be born by the favor of the divine realm. In ancient Greece, by the favor of the goddess Artemis. Contrast that to the hideous view of Thomas Malthus, in which nature simply cannot sustain population, which just easily grows beyond the limits, and then in his joyless world there's no divine bounty, there's no cornucopia to sustain the life that the gods allow to be born. So unless we use the preventive check, then nature, this faceless nature, needs to come in with the death-dealing epidemics and plagues and ultimately starvation and kill the people off. Can you see that this is the very opposite of what we celebrate at Thanksgiving and represent with the Cornucopia? Malthus is simply wrong, and here's why. His assumption is that population and natural resources are in a constant battle with one another. Population, natural resources. If population tries to get the upper hand, then the lack of resources will simply kill off any excess population through famine, which is ultimately the lack of enough resources to eat, starvation. But what's Malthus's major malfunction? What's his major mistake? What's Malthus's major mistake? We've already seen the answer. The answer is that not only are the natural resources such as grain and grapes and soil all gifts from the divine infinite realm, but men and women themselves are gifts from the gods, and their talents are gifts from the gods. So it's not a question of population versus resources. The population is full of resources, is a resources pool, infinite resources in the form of their gifts given to them by heaven, infinite potential. The gifts of the people are the most precious of all the resources. So Malthus is simply wrong. He's wrong, 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 wrong. And his hideous doctrine is immoral. And it would have shocked the ancients, such as Plutarch, who would have rightfully perceived immediately that this teaching slanders the gods. It slanders life-giving Demeter and Dionysus and all the other gods and goddesses who give their gifts to men and women. But at this point, some of you may be wondering, what's the big deal? Malthus lived so long ago, and we don't need to have less sex anymore because that's just old-fashioned, and Malthus didn't know about the pill or other forms of birth control, right? Well, if you think the twisted teachings of Thomas Malthus are a thing of the past, you're also mistaken. The insightful analyst and historian Matthew Arrett, with whom I obviously don't agree on all points, but who is 100% correct on this big picture vision, perceives that this Malthusian worldview stands behind an anti-growth, anti-population, imperialist agenda that views the world as a fixed pie with only enough slices for a certain number of eaters, which means that any slice that one person takes must come at the expense of another person. And that's why the proponents of empire don't want nations to build up their populations and build up their infrastructure and grow their own prosperity, because Malthusians believe that any gain by someone else diminishes the pie for everyone else. And so they institute an explicitly, deliberately anti-growth agenda. And as Matthew Arrett points out very insightfully, this philosophy was actually put down in writing in black and white by a panel led by Henry Kissinger in a document known as National Security Study Memorandum 200, or the Kissinger Report. This document was delivered to the White House in 1974, and it was only declassified in 1989. You can now read the entire thing online, although the document does contain a number of kind of obvious typos, which I highly doubt were present in the original. I mean, it's just sloppy. It's like this misspelling of executive summary that you see here. So I really wonder what's going on with that. But this file is on a .gov website, and the contents of the report are not really in question. You can clearly see the recommendations of the Kissinger Report from 1974. Quote, "It is urgent that measures to reduce fertility be started and made effective in the 1970s and 1980s. End quote. There it is, in black and white. We need to have fewer babies because the earth cannot sustain us. And note that on this page, we can see that the report is especially concerned with the fact that population growth is fastest in the regions of Asia and Latin America, and especially in Africa. So if you have this fixed pie mindset, which the authors of this study most definitely have, that means, oh, these other continents are threatening to take too much of the pie at the expense of Europeans and the United States. And that's why this is a national security memorandum, because this mindset sees the growth of people as a threat, an actual security threat, not as a blessing. Like Malthus, they don't realize that men and women and their gifts should be seen as a blessing, not as a curse. But you might be saying, come on, this is 1974, not 1824 or 1874. Surely this Kissinger report can't be inspired by the twisted thinking of Thomas Malthus, right? Well, look for yourself. This 1974 policy memo goes on to say on page 9 that, quote, present developments point towards Malthusian conditions for many regions of the world. Now, I guess they have heard of Malthus. On the same page, they basically channel Malthus and say, quote, a much more vigorous effort to slow population growth can also mean a very great difference between enormous tragedies of malnutrition and starvation, end quote. In other words, you either have to have the preventive check, like Malthus said, or you're going to get Malthusian consequences, malnutrition and starvation. It's a completely Malthusian document. It even says that we can't wait for the people to adopt the preventive check on their own. They don't say preventive check, but they write on page 7 that, quote, we cannot wait for overall modernization and development to produce lower fertility rates naturally, since this will undoubtedly take many decades in most developing countries, during which time rapid population growth will tend to slow development and widen even more the gap between rich and poor, end quote. Okay, so the anti-population people are worried about the gap growing between rich and poor, right? Well, before you start thinking that 1974 is also ancient history, please remember it's not really ancient history at all. For one thing, Henry Kissinger is still advising United States presidents to this very day. And for another thing, as Matthew Arrett points out, this memo came out in 1974. And it's not a coincidence at all that this is the exact same point in time that an anti-growth agenda was clamped down on the United States and in other countries, the Malthusians literally slammed on the brakes of the economy since the early 70s. Since the early 70s, the United States has basically built no infrastructure whatsoever, and it's just deindustrialized deliberately. It's watched its manufacturing capacity crumble and rust. And there's a direct correlation between this Malthusian philosophy articulated in this national security memo, the Kissinger report, and the austerity agenda that's been imposed on the world by these neo-Malthusians since the early 70s, and which has predictably brought impoverishment, immiseration, and economic despair, all of which make it harder to have families by making it harder and harder to afford to have children. There's a direct break between the world that was before this document and the world since then. Here's some photographs of former places of business, former factories, former sites of industry in the United States, and now they're empty and rotting. And I myself have seen these kinds of sites all over the country. In fact, I took some of these photographs myself. Here's some photographs of men and women wandering around unemployed and homeless. Also a common sight around the United States today. I myself see these kinds of scenes on a daily basis. In fact, I took some of these photographs myself. The ancient worldview was that the gifts given to men and women are gifts from the gods and part of the resources of a nation, the nation into which those men and women are allowed by the gods to be born. So to squander those gifts is an insult to the gods. In other words, to deliberately put a ball and chain around the economy so that there's more austerity and less prosperity is to doom more men and women to unemployment and the lack of ways for them to express the gifts that have been given to them by heaven. This twisted and immoral Malthusian view says that population is not a blessing but a curse, and that people just represent mouths consuming resources rather than gifts to help grow the pie for everyone. So Malthusians want to consciously impose limits on birth, and they want to do it beyond what people would naturally or normally choose. They want to impose austerity, which directly limits growth and limits population, and it also directly benefits oligarchs at the expense of everyone else, as I've explained in other videos. And oligarchy is also an offense to the gods, and it's directly criticized by the gods in ancient texts, such as in the Odyssey. So this whole view is directly in opposition to the symbol of the Cornucopia held by the god of wealth, this horn of plenty that never runs out. It's the opposite of this ancient view of abundance. It's a view of austerity. And that horn of plenty symbolizes the view that the blessings of the gods are sufficient to sustain life, and also the view that life itself is a blessing of the gods, and that each birth is given by the gods, and that the gifts and talents of each man and woman are themselves given from heaven. So this Thanksgiving, I wish you blessings and abundance. I hope that you will choose the ancient symbol of the Cornucopia and all that it represents and reject the hateful, twisted teachings of Malthus and his followers, teachings which see men and women as a curse rather than as a blessing, and which slander the superabundance of nature and the gods as insufficient, when in fact the very opposite is true. Thank you so much for watching.